When we leave off with Antietam, we leave President Lincoln in a bit of a quandary. He has a decision to make. Up until this point, this war has been fought entirely, at least publicly. The claim is that it's about the Union being an everlasting bond, and that you cannot break the bounds of the Union, and so the South has to be brought back into it, even if it means using force. But Lincoln is getting a lot of pressure to make this war about more than just Union, and to make it about slavery, and to make this a clear moral decision. And part of that pressure actually comes from the fact that they need to convince countries like England and France to stay out of the business of the United States in this instance. Lincoln had said very famously once that if he could win the war by freeing all of the slaves, he would do that. But if he could win the war by freeing none of them, he would do that too. For him, this war doesn't start about slavery. It starts about union and constitution and what being a country means. And it's not until we get until after Antietam that we see the focus of the war change in an official capacity. After the win at Antietam, Lincoln feels like he finally has the leverage that he needs to write the Emancipation Proclamation, which is kind of publicly delivered on January 1st of 1863. Lincoln uses his war power as president during this domestic insurrection to free all of the slaves that are located in the Deep South and those who are located in areas that the Union Army occupies. Now this is a little tricky because it's not frees all the slaves. Lincoln does not free all the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation. That will not come until after the war, when there is a constitutional amendment banning slavery put in place. So this does not apply to states like the border states. It doesn't apply to places like Missouri and Maryland. It doesn't necessarily apply to Kentucky. It applies to places where the Union Army is moving into. The states that have seceded, this applies to them. And so it cannot be put into effect, obviously, until the Union Army arrives in those locations. Even though it doesn't free all the slaves, it makes the focus of this war and the attention of this war about slavery. Because now, what's going to happen in the end is very clear cut. If the South loses, they will lose their slaves. That's what Lincoln sets on the table here. There's no going back after this. So if you lose, all of your slaves will be freed. That's what this says. This says that if the North wins this war, there will be no more slavery in this country. And this brings both praise and criticism on Lincoln. A lot of people were very supportive of this decision. Slaves eventually heard about it and were very excited. Abolitionists, obviously, extremely enthusiastic. Nobody really understands at this point that the 13th Amendment will really be the thing that ends slavery in this country forever. But there are people who are not happy, and you may be surprised by who some of those people are. In many situations, the people who are not excited about the idea of freeing the slaves are people who are not sure that slaves will be able to be citizens, that they're capable of that kind of work. People who are on the bottom of the economic ladder, they don't want to have to compete with freed slaves for jobs, so they're concerned about this idea. It's those people who found comfort in slavery because it protected their position as the last ladder rung on that ladder, who are not happy to see the direction of the war make this turn. Lincoln's decision with the Emancipation Proclamation is kind of further enforced a little bit or justified by what happens at Gettysburg during the summer of 1863. Lee needs some supplies, and he also needs to make a decisive turn. The South is eating away its supplies. It is literally eating the supplies that it has. And so if they don't seek out more supplies or do something to end this war quickly, they're in trouble. So Lee makes a pretty drastic decision in the summer of 1863. He goes to Pennsylvania. And the battle that follows at Gettysburg obviously is the most famous battle of the entire Civil War. Lee makes some bad decisions here, and he admits that he ruined this for the South at this particular moment. In fact, after the battle is over, he tries to resign his position as general of the Army of Virginia. He loses a third of his army in Gettysburg, and he never takes his army back to the North again. This is a resounding win for the North. This is their first truly celebratory win. I mean, it was hard to celebrate Antietam because 22,000 people died in a single day. And the losses here at Gettysburg are heavy. But this sends Lee scampering back to Virginia as fast as he can, dragging a battered and bloody and beaten army behind him. But Lincoln is not happy after Gettysburg. You might be thinking, like, oh, he'll feel better now. No. He actually is pissed because General Meade, who led the efforts at Gettysburg, refuses to follow Lee into Virginia. He sits at Gettysburg, licks his wounds a little bit, celebrates his victory. He does not pursue Lee, even though he knows that Lee has just lost a third of his army and is extremely weakened by it. So after Gettysburg, there's not a lot of celebration. There is obviously the consecration of this ground. This becomes a national cemetery. When they make the declaration, Lee gives his very famous Gettysburg Address, which is always an interesting story to me. The guy that talked before President Lincoln at the Gettysburg Memorial talked for 2 hours. I mean, I'm sure after like 50 minutes, you guys are really tired of listening to me. Imagine standing there in the cold, listening to somebody blather on for 2 hours. So Lincoln gets up and he's thinking, I'm not as good a speaker as that guy, and he talked for 2 hours, and he has 3 minutes of material. The Gettysburg Address took President Lincoln 3 minutes to read, and it is, I would suggest, the most famous speech in all of American history. And when he was done, he thought, well, they didn't like that very much. I wasn't very good. I didn't do a very good job. He lays out in the Gettysburg Address these ideas about what the country should be like and why they are fighting and how important the idea of union is, and that the people who have died here should not be forgotten and should not be lost in vain, and that they need to finish the job that they started. This gives a lot of encouragement to the North. They still have enough people. They're about to get more here in a minute. They have enough supplies. They are growing enough food. If they can just stay the course and make this last long enough, this will work out. No sooner does Gettysburg end than the federal government institutes its privilege to draft more soldiers into the military. One of the components here is that immigration into the United States slowed down during the war, and you can see why. I mean, who wants to come to a country who's in the middle of slaughtering each other? Nobody. Well, I shouldn't say nobody. Very few people. One of the other things that was deterring people from coming to the United States during the war was the fact that both sides had a draft. And the Northern draft drafted a lot of new immigrants. People would come to this country, they'd sign in, sign the roll, and then almost immediately be recruited into the army. And if they didn't get recruited in, a lot of times they were drafted in. A lot of new immigrants did enlist. They got payment right at the beginning, and then they were promised another payment at the end, and it's guaranteed monthly money if you can survive. So we have a lot of Union troops who are recent immigrants into the United States, in part because it was a way to get paid. There is a problem, though, with the combination of a new draft being put together and the Emancipation Proclamation, and we see that problem spill over in New York City during the summer of 1863. This riot is led by Irish laborers who did not want to see slaves freed because they didn't want to compete with them for jobs. So they resented being drafted. One of the issues here that I should bring up is that there was a way to get out of the draft. You could pay. you could pay $300 and get out of the draft. So if you're rich enough, you just pay your money, or you can pay a substitute so you can give somebody else $300 and they can go in your place. But if you're a poor Irish laborer or a poor recent Irish immigrant to the United States, where are you going to come up with $300 so that you don't have to go fight? It won't happen. So they resented fighting, and they resented slaves competing with them for jobs. And so that boils over into the draft riot of the summer of 1863. And this thing is brutal. I mean, the draft itself only gets about 48,000 troops overall. We have twice that many people rioting in the streets of New York City. They burn draft buildings, draft offices. They attack mansions. They terrorized and burned to the ground an African-American orphanage. They killed orphans. They lynched African-American people who were walking down the street. That's what you're seeing here. They have hung someone, set him on fire, and are shooting at him. This is a crazy riot. It is absolutely fueled with racial hatred and tension and economic disparity. It killed over 100 people, and it gets so bad that Lincoln has to order troops from Gettysburg. I mean, these people have just finished surviving a horrible 3-day battle, and they're put on a train and sent to New York City to put down this riot. Can you imagine that? I survived Gettysburg, and instead of, I survived Gettysburg, all I got was this lousy t-shirt, all you get is a trip to New York City to put down an Irish mob riot. Lovely. This does indicate a couple of things about the draft, the idea of the draft, and the implications of the Emancipation Proclamation. In the North, you could buy your way out of the draft. In the South, you could buy your way out of the draft too. $300 cash will get you a substitute or a buyout. But the South has another exemption that really makes people in the South angry and shows you the inequalities that existed in the South. If you owned more than 20 slaves, you could stay home. If you owned more than 40 slaves, you could stay home, and so could another white man. For every 20 slaves that you owned, you could have one white person stay on your farm and not be drafted. This obviously helps rich planters, the wealthiest Southerners, who have the most to lose in this war, helps them not have to go fight it, and helps them keep their sons at home and their nephews at home. The more slaves you have, the more buyouts you have, the more you can just stay home, deal with your slaves. The idea here, in all seriousness, was that they really were afraid that slaves in the South would revolt during the war, causing, any number of troubles and problems here. I wanted to show you this map so that you could see which areas of the South have the most slavery. Where a lot of the fighting takes place during the Civil War is this area in here, where obviously there are some darkly colored counties indicating that there is a density of slavery. But in places where the Union Army doesn't get until the end, like South Carolina, you can see this stretch of Alabama and Mississippi and up and down the Mississippi River. We have huge pockets of slaves, very dense populations of slaves. For these people to be freed, technically, during the war, the Union Army will have to get to them. And that is going to take until, in some of these places, actually, the spring of 1865. As I mentioned before, the Southern Army does have a draft. Slaves are not drafted. Slaves are not going to be serving because they don't want to give slaves guns. The Southern Army, in contrast to the Northern Army, will have roughly, it's close to 1 million people who serve. So it's half the number of people from the North. The South has some unique problems in its own army. First of all, they don't have as many people, but they still have a draft, and they have all these exemptions to the draft. They end up drafting men between the ages of 18 and 35. But by the end of the war, when they are desperate for bodies to use in the army, they will extend that draft to between the ages of 17 and 50. That's a huge swath of men who were at least eligible for a draft. In the South, they enforce their draft and they enforce military rules in a very kind of violent way. They have a home guard. And the Southern Home Guard is responsible for making sure that you are not draft dodging, that you have not deserted and come home illegally. They shoot people who are deserters. They don't necessarily send them back to the Army. They kill them on the spot. So desertions in the South become a touchy subject. The reason that a lot of people deserted the Southern Army was because their families were having a hard time at home. They don't have enough food. They cannot get the cotton crop in and out in enough time. They don't have any money. And so we see a lot of people starting to write to their soldier husbands or soldier fathers and saying, please come home. We're starving to death. Please come home. I can't feed the kids. Please come home. The Army's been here and they stole everything we had. And imagine getting letter after letter after letter like that and just sort of staying where you are. There's a lot of pressure on people roughly midway through the war as this thing kind of drags on that they need to go home and that they shouldn't have enlisted for 3 years. There are estimates that put the number of desertions in the Southern Army as high as 100,000 people. That's the reason they had a home guard, and that's the reason they're acting so brashly when it comes to punishing deserters that they locate. Because when you have 100,000 people who at any given moment are trying to leave the Army, you have a force that is severely weakened. The South faces the most destruction during the war. That probably goes without saying. They lose the ability to connect with their industry. So you can have a factory in the South that's making guns, but it doesn't do you any good if you can't get the guns to the Army. Their railroad system ends up ultimately being almost totally destroyed. They had rail connections, the place where rail lines meet, a whole bunch of them. Places like Atlanta, which is in this picture, Nashville, even New Orleans was a terminus. Those are places that the Union Army captures and destroys or captures and occupies. We also see their food-producing regions destroyed. Obviously, early in the war, they're cut off from the western half of the Southern Confederacy, but one of the biggest food-supporting regions in the country was the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and that's where most of the fighting is taking place on the eastern front of this war. You can't be putting in corn and wheat if somebody's blowing up your field and your barn every 6 months. They have a shortage of doctors, in part because they had a shortage of schools. There are no Southern medical schools during this time period because the South refused to spend money on education. So now this comes to pass that this haunts them. They needed to be investing this money, as it turns out, because it would have helped them during the war. They're also suffering because of the blockade. The Union Army has shut down the water transportation of the South. So only smugglers are really able to get things in and out of the South with any regularity. So they can't sell their cotton because they can't get it out, and they can't get food and other supplies in. This problem becomes so severe that we're going to have food riots in the South starting in 1863. Not just because people can't get food, but because food is so expensive. And food is expensive, but then add on top of that the fact that Southern currency is virtually worthless because they're printing money, but they don't have any money in the bank. So, hypothetically, if you took your 10 Confederate dollars to a bank and you said, I want $10 worth of gold for this, they couldn't give it to you. They couldn't give you $10 of anything. So that makes the inflation of their currency makes food prices rise out of control. Flour is selling for $70 a barrel. One woman who participated in a food riot in Richmond, Virginia said, I have 7 children, what shall I do? And one of the kind of sarcastic responses back to her was, I don't know, madam, unless you eat your children. It was meant to be a joke, but it's not that funny. $70 for a barrel of flour. A barrel of flour would feed an entire family for maybe a month or two. $70, that isn't even what enlisted troops in the Confederate Army are making. So the idea that they had a food riot in Richmond, that's the capital. They were throwing bricks through Jefferson Davis's windows at his house. They were so angry. If you can't feed the people in your own capital city, what kind of war effort do you have put together? This is going to be the haunting problem for the South from here on out. Lee's army has been weakened, they are running out of food, their currency is worthless, and every advance of the Union Army from 1863 until the end cripples their internal communication systems and their supply line. African Americans, you will only see them fighting in the North, obviously. It's not really until 1863 that Lincoln allows free African Americans to enlist in the Army in any meaningful way. But roughly 200,000 of them will either serve in the Union Army or work for the Union Army. We had a lot of African Americans who served as support troops and not fighting troops. The people who chose to serve as black soldiers in the Union Army understood that they faced a greater danger than their white comrades. First of all, they're forced to serve in segregated units with white officers. They are often put in the front lines of the battle, which means that they will take the heaviest casualties. They are awarded jobs that nobody else wants to do, like, for example, go first across the battlefield, but also cleaning the toilets, doing the laundry, having to cook the food. So they are not treated as equals inside the Union Army, even though they are fighting for the freedom of other African Americans in the South. They get paid a third less until 1864, when Lincoln decides that they should be paid the same rate as everybody else. They have an extremely high death rate, and if they are captured by the Confederate Army, they are either sold as slaves or they're killed, sometimes on the spot. They faced much greater dangers to provide this service. It's almost amazing that 200,000 of them agree to help. 1864 is a turning point. 1864 marks the first year that Ulysses S. Grant will be put in charge of the main army of Virginia. And it's the year that Lee sees a serious decline in the abilities of his own army. It's also an election year. So Lincoln has to run for re-election smack dab in the middle of the Civil War. You can understand this would have been a tense time for him. He really needed the army to perform well so that he would get re-elected. He was really concerned about that. So he's counting on General Grant to come in and finish this war. He understands a few things about Grant. Grant is aggressive. He's been aggressive every time he's been in charge of an army, and sometimes to the detriment of that army. Sometimes his aggressiveness causes enormous amounts of casualties and losses. But with him in charge of the Union Army, Lincoln at least thinks, I've got a guy that'll fight. He saw Grant as a fighter where these other generals have failed to actually aggressively go after Lee. And Grant understands this. He understands that to win the war and finish the thing, you've got to go get him. You've got to go all the way to Richmond. You've got to destroy Lee's army. You have to make it impossible for the South to continue on its own. So starting in 1864, Grant will wage an aggressive campaign against Lee. He literally chases him all over the state of Virginia. Grant says, and this is a slightly cold-blooded thing to say, but he says that if he takes twice as many losses as Lee, he'll win. So essentially he's boiling it down to manpower. Grant can afford to lose 2 men for every 1 that Lee loses. And that's exactly how Grant chooses to fight in 1864. He will incur massive losses of life as long as he keeps forcing Lee to fight and engage and lose people. He feels like in a war of attrition, where we're just kind of losing and losing and losing people, he will come out the victor. The South cannot afford that kind of loss. They can't afford to lose supplies. They can't afford to lose people. They do not have a renewable source of either of those things. Grant also is going to raise the stakes. He feels like, and Lincoln feels the same way, that there is a lot of the South that hasn't really had to face the music at all. And they're looking at you, South Carolina. South Carolina kicked this thing off, and they really haven't been punished at all. So Grant is going to send his old buddy Sherman. Sherman, by the way, is feeling better by 1864. Moving him through Tennessee, down through the Deep South, on his march to the sea. He's going to bring the war to Southern civilians and, in a way, kind of punish them for having started this in the first place. That's kind of the mindset there. In his campaign to chase Lee around Virginia, Grant will lose roughly 50,000 troops. Lee will lose roughly half that. Grant can replace those 50,000. Lee cannot. I'm not a big fan of battle maps. You guys probably have noticed that by now. But I wanted you to see where all of this activity is, especially during the course of 1864, although there's more than 1864 on this particular map. You can see up here in the area of Washington, D.C., if you look up towards Virginia and Maryland, that this is really where most of the fighting takes place. Obviously, between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, that's kind of the hot point. But we also see on this map, you can see Sherman's path. Ooh, where'd my pointer go? There we go. Sherman leaves from Chattanooga. He marches to Atlanta. This is it's a strategic center for the South. Rail lines, some industry. Atlanta is an important location. And the Southerners will set Atlanta on fire so that Sherman cannot steal all of the supplies that are located in Atlanta. So that's all well and good, but that also means that the South can't have those supplies either. Sherman doesn't stop in Atlanta. He moves all the way through Georgia, cutting a swath about a mile wide. I would almost liken it to a tornado that just cuts a path through the land. They destroy private property. They take supplies from the citizens of Georgia, food, anything they can get their hands on. Sherman did, it should be said, try to keep his troops in line so that they didn't hurt people. They were not supposed to be killing civilians. They were not supposed to be raping women. That is not the point here. It's not to terrorize people. It is, however, to take property and belongings that might help the South's war effort. So property is fair game, people are not. They go to Savannah, and they like Savannah so much they don't set it on fire. That's why there is not a major battle fireball there. And then, what everybody had been waiting for, they go up through South Carolina, and they devastated South Carolina. But they do decide not to go to Charleston. Charleston is kind of well in hand at this point. They're blockaded. They can't really do much of anything. And truth be told, they didn't want to destroy the city of Charleston. It's one of the oldest in the United States. And so they leave Charleston in peace and take a shortcut back up through the Carolinas with the intention that they will ultimately end up in Richmond about the same time that General Grant does. So if they'd swung all the way out to Charleston, they would have lost some miles, so they march back up there and destroy everything they can get their hands on. I think most people know how the story ends. Grant does eventually wear Lee down. Lee is out of food. He's running out of ammunition. His men are physically and mentally exhausted. There are not as many of them left as there were a year before. And so in the spring of 1865, Lee doesn't know what else he's supposed to do. He doesn't feel like he can defend Richmond properly. He doesn't think that his army has any fight left in them at all, at least it won't get them all killed. So he sort of reluctantly surrenders to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. You should also know it wasn't an actual courthouse, it was someone's home. And actually the guy whose home it was where they meet to sign the surrender papers, he had moved his family to Appomattox Courthouse because their previous home had been hit with artillery shells during the First Battle of Bull Run at the very beginning of the war. So that man's property saw the beginning of the Civil War, and now it sees the end. It's kind of a neat story. As is the story of the surrender. Grant shows up disheveled, dirty. He didn't actually know Lee was going to surrender until he got the memo. Lee shows up in full dress uniform, wearing his sidearm, his sword, the whole 9 yards. And Grant, they're kind of nervous, and Grant says, we've met before. and Lee didn't remember him. They'd met during the Mexican-American War. And they make some small chit-chat, and then Lee says, I need to give you my sword and surrender. And Grant says, keep your sword, sir, and tell me what your soldiers need. Grant is asking for an unconditional surrender. There will be no more fighting from Lee's army after this point, and Lee agrees to the unconditional surrender. He expects at this point that he might be arrested. He thinks he might be charged as a traitor, and he thinks there's a possibility he could eventually be executed. So he doesn't take this whole thing lightly. Lee's property has already been confiscated by the Northerners. His property, his family farm, today is Arlington National Cemetery. That is the punishment that Lee receives, is that American military personnel are now buried on what was his plantation. And the home that sits on that property was Lee's home. But Grant says, well, I'm not going to have you arrested. Do your men need anything? And Lee says, well, to be honest, they're all hungry. We haven't eaten in 2 days. So Grant has all of his soldiers turn over their rations to the Southern soldiers. This is the first act of reconciliation of the Civil War. They are feeding people who 24 hours before they were shooting at and chasing. He also tells Lee that the men can keep their horses and they can keep their sidearms because they're going to need them when they get home. People still hunt during this time period. They need to defend themselves on their way home. He wants them to have guns and horses to do so. This is an exceptional act of generosity. Lee is blown over by it, actually. And as Lee rides away from Appomattox Courthouse, General Grant's men take their hats off. This is how Lincoln wanted the war to end. He wanted it to end quicker, obviously, but he wanted it to end with reconciliation instead of punishment. So Grant is not only doing what Grant thinks is right, but what Lincoln thinks is appropriate as well. But the damage here has been done. We've spent 4.5 years and 600,000 lives have been lost as a result of this war. This is not the final end of the Civil War, actually. Just because Lee surrenders doesn't mean that everybody else has. So there are a number of other Southern Army detachments floating around the South and the West who continue to fight. But for the most part, Lee's surrender is marked as the official end of the Civil War. There will be an attempt by the Jefferson Davis government to flee Richmond and to try to reconstitute again later, kind of in the days that follow Lee's surrender. Davis tries to remain president of the Confederacy. He tries to encourage Southerners to fight a guerrilla war where they will be not fighting as a whole army but will be fighting kind of as independent individuals. And that effort, it doesn't really go very far at all. People are exhausted. They are demoralized. They sort of see the light at the end of the tunnel, most of them. There are other examples of generosity here at the end of the war. We've got some other armies that surrender where Northerners salute Southern soldiers, offer them souvenirs. We get some kind of almost like a swap meet of sorts in some locations. And so Lincoln feels as though by the second week of April in 1865 that he has finally guided the country through the end. And that's why what happens a week later is that much more horrifying. Lincoln lives to see the end of the war, but 9 days later he's murdered at the theater in Washington, D.C. by John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth was an ardent Confederate. He believed strongly in slavery. He thought blacks were racially inferior. He believed in the idea that states should decide their own outcomes without the help of the federal government. And he also wanted the South to keep fighting. It appears as though he felt like if he killed Abraham Lincoln, that would give the South a chance to recover and fight on. So that's his motivator here. And he does have help. It's not just him. He obviously shoots Lincoln in the theater. He shoots him in the head. Lincoln slips into a coma and dies the next morning. But the other aspects of this conspiracy include other people who are set to assassinate other members of Lincoln's government. They try to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson, but Johnson doesn't answer the door. They had somebody stab Secretary of State Seward in the chest. Poor Secretary of State Seward. The man's in his bed. He's wearing a nightgown because men during the 1860s wore nightgowns. And an intruder jumps on him in bed, stabs him multiple times, and then runs out of his house. Interesting side story here. Seward apparently was a very small man, very frail, so he got really cold all the time. He was buried under like 6 layers of blankets, so when this crazy guy stabbed him a whole bunch of times, it didn't go very deep into his chest because he had all these blankets on top of him. Unbelievable. But the idea that John Wilkes Booth had was not just to kill Lincoln, but to kill enough people in the federal government that the federal government would be thrown into disarray. They wouldn't know what to do. They wouldn't know who was in charge. And this would give the South a window. So that's the idea here. And only the biggest part of the idea actually works. There are other ideas about, whether the Confederacy ordered this as a hit, whether Jefferson Davis knew about it, all of these other things. None of that has really been proven. What has been proven is that John Wilkes Booth did a pretty effective job of shooting President Lincoln in the head. One of the things that people think might have set Booth off wasn't just the end of the war, but also the rumors that were circulating around Washington, D.C. that Lincoln was going to support giving African American men the right to vote. Booth was a racist. I can't really candy coat that for you. And so some people have argued that the one thing that really made him do this was the idea that Lincoln was going to give black men the right to vote. And that, whether or not that can be solidly proven or not is kind of a different story, but it is one of the perspectives that's been offered up. Lincoln didn't actually put together a comprehensive plan for what he thought should happen at the end of the war. He had said in a number of occasions that he wanted the reconciliation of the two parts of the country to come quickly. He wanted it to be done without enmity or without punishing the South too severely. He wanted to move on with the business of being a united country. We don't know exactly where he stood on extending rights to former slaves or to freed slaves. One of the most famous quotes regarding Lincoln's assassination came from the Secretary of War, Edward Stanton. And he said, "Now he belongs to the ages." And the ages obviously have remembered Lincoln very fondly. The picture of Lincoln that you're looking at was taken just a few days before he was killed. It is the last picture of President Lincoln, and the crack that runs through the top was because the glass plate that the photo was taken with, it was broken. The photographer dropped the plate. And Lincoln said, don't worry about it. I'll come back in a couple days. You can do it again. And of course, in a couple days, he was dead. So this is the last picture that we have of Lincoln. And you can see how he aged over the course of this 4.5 years. I mean, you almost don't think it's the same person. One of the things that his death does is that it creates a power vacuum at the top. Lincoln made most of the decisions about the war himself. He was a one-man wartime show. And without him to strong-arm the direction of what happens next, we're going to have a really big problem. Because now there's a power grab in Washington, D.C. There are dozens of ideas about what should happen next. And the vice president, who is now the president of the United States for the next almost 3 years, because, Lincoln just won re-election in 1964, is Andrew Johnson, who is a Southerner. He is one of the only loyalists who remained in Congress during the war from the South. And Lincoln actually thought it would be a good idea to make him vice president so that when the war was over, the South would feel maybe not so out of it. But now we have the war over, the leader of this whole cause dead, and a Southerner in the White House. And that's going to open us up both to end this class here coming up shortly, but also to set up any number of problems about what's going to happen now that the war is over.